So in addition to looking at our world champions and seeing what their take is and how their approach is to an opening, I think it's also important to look at historical games. So in that respect, we'll look at a number of games. Grunfeld versus Carlos Repetito Torre, the first Grandmaster from the great country of Mexico. This was played in Baden-Baden 1925 and is an amazing crush in 13 moves. Imagine a Grandmaster getting checkmated or resigning in 13 moves. Next, we'll look at Alexander Kotov, well-known Russian Grandmaster, getting crushed in 27 moves by Igor Bondaresky in Leningrad 1936. We'll also look at one of the most brilliant games ever played in the Stonewall Dutch. Glucksberg versus Miguel Najdorf. This was played in the Warsaw Olympiad 1935. 22 moves, but absolute brilliancy. And also in our historical section, Vladimir Magakanov against the amazing David Bronstein, played in the USSR Championship, Leningrad 1947. Bronstein won in 50 moves. These games are very important to study, to understand, to soak up the ideas, and some of the tactics are just stunning. Because while the exact or precise variation may not come up in your own game, but a lot of the tactical ideas and strategic ideas will. So very important to have an appreciation of the historical games in your opening. Next we come to one of the parts of the video that should be absolutely the most fun, the most entertaining, and to some degree I find it the most astounding that after you look at some of these games, you'll be wondering, why isn't the Stonewall Dutch as popular as, say, the Grunfeld defense or the King's Indian defense? Personally, I think it's a lot more fun, and certainly a lot less charted and well understood by the white players. These are the historical games, some of the classic, brilliant attacking games that have been played over the years in the Stonewall Dutch. We'll start out with d4, e6. The game Ernst Grunfeld, a Grandmaster, against Carlos Repetito Torre from Baden-Baden 1925. Now, of course, Torre had a very short career and posthumously was named Grandmaster after FIDE reviewed his results, and he was just absolute brilliant talent. First Grandmaster ever from Mexico. Well, knight f3, f5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, d5, castles, bishop d6. Already you can see he plays kind of a modern version of the Stonewall, c4 and c6. So with c6 he absolutely has set up the modern Stonewall with the bishop on d6. Queen c2, castles, and now b3. Well, of course, as we've mentioned several times already, b3, white has the potential idea of bishop to a3 to exchange the dark squared bishop. And of course we saw Magnus in 2 games played queen to e7 to prevent that from happening. Well, here, again, this is 1925. Theory is not as developed. Knight to e4, very direct, was played. Now, of course, bishop to b2 was played, but Tigran Petrosian would later exchange the dark squared bishops with bishop to a3. And that's how theory develops. But at the time this game was played, bishop b2, knight d7, and knight into e5. Well, black could already get equality with knight takes, pawn takes, and simply bishop back to e7. No problems whatsoever. In fact, just note that white has to be a little bit careful. If he plays f3, for example, he could run into something like queen to b3 check and knight f2 check. Just run that up the flagpole, this type of idea. And note that king over, of course, would allow the classic smothered mate. Games from my childhood. But anyway, after queen f6, you can see he puts tremendous pressure on the e5 knight. Well, Grunfeld decides to play f3 to evict the black knight as a prelude to building in the center with e4. However, timing is bad, and the result is what we now call an epic fail on White's part. Of course, White should just move the knight back to d3, and the position's fairly equal. But instead, after f3, this is an excellent combination and tactic for you to keep in mind. So it's very important to understand the strategies for both sides, but it's also important to understand recurring tactical themes. Here, this is an all-time classic. He plays knight takes on e5. Well, here, f takes e4, absolutely necessary. On knight g4, the pawn fork e5 allows queen over to h6. Of course, the idea now is pawn takes would allow queen h2, checkmate. After queen h6, h3, knight e3, queen up to d3, knight takes f1, pawn takes d6, knight back to e3, bishop to c1, pawn to f4, pawn takes on f4, knight takes on g2, bishop takes g2, and queen h4. Black has the exchange up. Okay, White has a passed pawn on d6, but the black king is looking a little bit safer than his white counterpart, who is threatened with up and over. Rook lift. Now, going back to the game after knight takes e5, White's best chance was to play c5, leaving all the black pieces hanging. But then, for example, knight f7, f takes e4, if c takes d6, knight takes, black has an extra pawn. After f takes e4, bishop back to c7, pawn to e5, queen at g6, and black has counterplay. He's got possibilities of cartwheeling the knight to g5 and back into e4. He can also potentially play b6 at some point and get this bishop out to a6. So, already black is okay, but White, after knight takes e5, mistakenly played pawn takes on e5. Well, this is simply bad for a few reasons. One, he could probably just play bishop takes e5. But maybe that was his idea. Maybe he calculated bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and knight to c3, and figured he'd trap the queen. Probably Ernst Grunfeld calculated this, and this is why after knight takes e5, he was tempted into d takes e5. But the queen side is not where black has an interest. Torrey plays bishop to c5 check. After king h1, he lands the knockout punch, knight takes g3 check. Imagine, and White resigned. A 13-move win with black in the Stonewall Dutch defense. Well, after knight takes, simply pawn takes, queen check, bishop h3, and queen takes h3 mate. As I said, I'm amazed that this opening is not so much more popular for black than it actually is, but that's a good thing for us. Anyway, fantastic game from 1925. So moving up a little in time, forward a little, our next game comes from 1936. Two of the real heavyweights of the Russian school of chess in the 30s and 40s were Grandmaster Alexander Kotov, playing white in this game, and Grandmaster Igor Bondarevsky, considered one of the top-notch Soviet trainers. As mentioned, this was played in Leningrad, 1936. Black plays e6, our preferred move order. Again, if White plays e4, we can confidently now play d5 and go for our French defense opening repertoire. In this game, Kotov plays knight f3. Now, by the way, just to mention, Alexander Kotov wrote what at that time was one of the classics, Think Like a Grandmaster. Came out somewhere in the 1970s, and I remember reading it and he talked about various Soviet training techniques and so forth. Think like a grandmaster. Absolute classic, a little bit dated now because things have moved on, but considered one of the mainstays of the Soviet school of chess in the 30s and 40s. So knight f3, f5, g3, knight out, bishop g2, d5, castles, and once again we see bishop to d6. This is the modern Stonewall, if you will. A little more aggressive than putting the bishop on e7. After c4, on to c6. We can see Bondaresky has established the Stonewall formation. Knight bd2, castles, and then b3. Well, now, with the knight having already gone to d2, there is no threat to play bishop a3, exchanging the bishops, so queen rolls to e8, knight goes back to e1, very elaborate maneuvers by white, knight at b to d7, knight to d3, and knight to e4, occupying the key e4 outpost. Knight to f3. Now, I think we mentioned this briefly, but f3, for example, trying to push the knight out, could be a little premature and dangerous because one of the key ideas in our modern Stonewall of developing the bishop on d6 versus e7 is we're pointed much more aggressively at the king. For example, this type of sacrifice could be a little bit dangerous. And then queen h5. However, it's probably premature here because rook d1, and after queen check, the king could actually flee. But on f3, lightning could potentially strike from the other side with knight to c3. And then on queen e1, pawn to e5, blasting open the position. After pawn takes, knight takes, the position for black is very pleasant, and for white, not so, because white's just a bit loose all over the board. So knight f3, queen to h5. Now here, if black wanted solid play, he could play b6, followed by bishop to b7, complete his development. What's not to like? He's got his stake in the center, a stud knight on e4, but Bondaresky played for the attack a la Botvinnik. Well, knight f4, pushing the queen back, and queen back to f7, queen to c2, but then g5, asking the knight to leave. Knight to d3, and queen to h5. Kind of reminds you of the Jack Nicholson movie, I'm back. But posting the queen on g7 was also an option. From g7, the pawn would be defended, and there would be pressure on the d4 pawn, and later if you played f4, potential to open the g file. But queen h5, knight at f to e5, rook to f6. This is crudity in itself. Just the old rook up and over, rook lift. Well, f3. Perhaps rook to d1, but then rook h6. After f3 came rook h6 for sure, threatening the h2 pawn. Well, h4. Pawn takes, queen check, king f2. King f2 would threaten rook h1, but then after king f2, a very nice attacking move, knight to f6. On rook e1, you'd have knight e4 check, king f1. If king f3, queen to g3 would be checkmate. On king f1, if king to e3, of course, queen g3 check, bishop f3, you would have f4 check, knight takes f4, pawn takes f4, king to d3, and queen takes on e1, with an 8-point advantage for the black team. Going back to knight f6, rook e1, knight e4 check, king f1, you would have knight to g3 check. king f2, knight e4 check, king f1, and queen h4 with complete compensation for the sacrificed piece. Now going back to the game, after f3, rook h3, white played h4. But if we think back to the teachings of William Steinitz, when your king is under attack, advancing pawns should be the last option, not the first option, because one, they can never go back, and two, the further you push them, the more exposed your king becomes. Well, here, Bondarevsky continued the attack with knight takes g3. Now, black, that is, white should consider bishop takes g5, knight takes, and rook takes, with compensation for the sacrificed exchange that he'll be recouping on h6 or g6. Instead, after knight takes g3, white was a little greedy, played pawn takes, attacking the rook. But then came queen h2 check, king f2, and fantastic move, rook to h4. After rook g1, the simple move, rook takes d4, and we can assess. Okay, black is a pawn ahead. He has a safer king, and the white e5 knight has been undermined. So at this point, after 20 moves, we can say the opening and the early middle game has been a huge success for Grandmaster Bondarevsky. Well, bishop b2, but now he could continue with simply knight takes e5. Bishop takes d4, knight check, pawn takes, queen to h4, bishop b2. Note that queen b2 would be met by the absolute shot, bishop a3 double exclam, on queen takes, knight check, check, queen takes, with a winning queen and knight coordinated attack. But on bishop b2, you could also simply play d takes and pawn to e5, also with a big advantage. Now, going back, after bishop b2, queen h4, bishop takes d4 happened. Here, Bondarevsky played very interesting. He could have played queen d4 check, king takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and queen over, threatening mate. After king f1, bishop f1, queen h2 mate. But in the game, he played knight e4. And he was very nicely rewarded when the white king bravely stepped up where no king should go and played king to e3, walking into the lion's den. Well, he should have played king back to f1, but then check, king f2, and then back to queen d4, as we saw previously. But in the game, after king e3, Bondarevsky played the beautiful touch f4. Well, we can see f4 is checkmate, except when you're in check, there's ABC. You can move away, block, or capture. In this instance, white has the option to capture. That's the only option. But then came queen f2 check, king to d3, and the fantastic finish, attraction sacrifice, queen takes d4 check, double exclamation point. Am I excited? Yes. Do I love the Stonewall Dutch defense? Yes. Did I win a lot of games with it when I was a child? Yes. And this is one of the all-time classics. Well, king takes, bishop c5 check, king to d3, and knight takes e5 mate finishes this masterpiece. Again, a stunning example of black's attacking possibilities in the Stonewall defense, a game played between two of the heavyweight grandmasters from the Soviet School of Chess. Now, played around the same time in 1935 at the Warsaw Olympiad. Incredible game, Glucksberg versus Grandmaster Miguel Najdorf. Now, of course, Najdorf was one of the more colorful figures in chess. Having to flee Europe during World War II, landed in Argentina. Of course, the Sicilian Najdorf, very famous opening used by Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov, was named after Miguel Najdorf. And let's take a look. So, f5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, d5, and up to now we've pretty much seen systems where white played g3 and did the kingside fianchetto. Well, another absolutely reasonable option is to play e3, simply defending the c4 pawn and continuing development. And we will have a section on typical play with black. Now myself, I kind of like it when white plays like this, because I go ahead and set up my Stonewall and post my bishop on d6, just like Miguel Najdorf did here. And that'll be our repertoire recommendation. Castles, castles, and now knight e2. Well, not exactly what the game plan is there, but all we can do is develop our pieces. And now here white plays knight to g5. Well, this is kind of a crude attempt to execute a knight fork on e6. And perhaps his idea is he wants to follow with f4. But now comes bishop takes h2 check. A little basic combination. Well, this part is obvious. Anyone can see that king takes is met by knight to g4 check and queen takes g5. Not only have you won a pawn, but you also have some attacking prospects. For example, f3. Well, you could follow with knight takes e3, threatening mate, and the queen. And after bishop takes, queen takes, you are simply 2 pawns ahead. Life is good. But what was much more interesting is the complications that ensued in the game after king to h1. Because now white threatens to capture on e6 with the fork and threatens to play g3, boxing in your bishop. What to do? Well, knight to g4. And this game is very, very instructive example. Najdorf does not bother defending against the fork, but instead moves his pieces ahead, threatens the knight, and starts to get closer to the white king. After all, in chess, the king is the thing. Well, f4 defending the knight on g5 and looking to trap the bishop. Now, of course, knight takes e6 would simply be foolhardy because queen h4, g3, bishop takes check, 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 and checkmate would be the standard antidote. But f4 was a much more clever try by white. As mentioned, he would like to play g3 and box in the bishop, and he also threatens the f4. Well, time for a queen shift a la Botvinnik, queen e8. Also strong was the rook lift, rook f6. But queen e8, bringing in the big gun. g3, threatening to trap the bishop on h2. Queen h5. King up. And now, this was the part that was hard to see. What to do at this point. White threatens simply rook over, tying up your attackers, and then trying to pilfer something. Of course, he would still have a challenge, but I imagine he would follow with something like knight up, and all your pieces are under attack. Well, Najdorf comes up with the problem in fine style. He plays the absolutely fabulous interference move, bishop to g1. And I have to confess, when you first played bishop takes h2 check and thought you were winning easily, this bishop g1 move might have been very, very hard to foresee. But that's why it's good to play through games like this, historical games, because you just compile more and more of these tactical motifs for your own practice. Well, knight takes. After bishop g1, of course, king takes is met by queen h2, checkmate. rook takes is met by check and checkmate. And of course, knight f3 is met by simply bishop takes e3, and the bishop has officially escaped. So after the beautiful bishop to g1 interference motif, and when we say interference, we're talking about it interferes with this rook coming across to h1, even if only for one move. But in a chess game, like in many things, one move can be an eternity. Well, knight takes on g1, but then queen h2 check, king f3, and it would appear that the white king is pretty safe. However, appearances can be rather deceiving, and Najdorf shows more tremendous energy. He plays e5, double exclamation point, simply blasting open the center and releasing the energy of more black attacking units. Now, what's the threat? Well, the immediate threat is e4 check. White would have to start sacrificing pieces, and then check. And then on pawn takes, check, and double check mate. So that is the immediate tactical threat after the central thrust e5. Beautiful tactical play by Miguel Najdorf. Well, in the game, white played d takes e5. As I was about to videotape this game, I started thinking about bishop takes f5, trying to knock the support out of the g4 knight. And of course it was very easy to realize, well, e4 check would be quite nice. If king takes g4, knight f6 mate would be very typical. After e4 check, if bishop takes, then you would have knight check and knight mate. The only variation left to consider would be sacking the knight. But then, in similar vein, you have check, 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 and pawn to h5 checkmate. I'm sure Najdorf calculated many of these variations once you have the main theme after e5. So after e5, d takes e5, he sacrificed a knight, he took, he went knight check, he went king f4, he went knight check, king back. Now of course black has a perpetual check if he wants. After all, he is a piece down, but he is not finished attacking yet. Watch this. He plays f4, unleashing the energy of the rook on f8 and the bishop on c8 to join the party. Well, of course, if g takes f4, knight h4 would be checkmate. So after f4, white did not take with the g pawn, but played e takes f4. But now came the fantastic bishop to g4, an attraction bishop sacrifice, and after king takes g4, note that king e3, you simply take the queen, bishop takes, rook takes, and continue the attack with knight takes f4, pawn takes f4. Note bishop h7 check wouldn't do anything because after takes, check, check, and rook over with a crushing 7-point advantage, or going back to the immediate capture, king e2 and queen f2 with an epaulette checkmate. Now, back to the game. After the beautiful bishop g4 check, the king took the bishop, and then knight e5 check. This is a deflection sacrifice to pull the pawn away, and after f takes e5, h5 checkmate. Beautiful attacking game by Miguel Najdorf. Well, the last game from our historical section features Vladimir Andreevich Magakanov, another one of the army of players from the Soviet School of Chess in the 30s and 40s, against David Bronstein, the challenger, first challenger to Mikhail Botvinnik for the World Championship. Bronstein playing black. This was actually played in the USSR Championship, Leningrad, 1947. Well, knight f3, d5, g3, and c6 right away. And we'll notice an interesting new idea here from Bronstein, who is considered one of the great original thinkers of the chess, not content to follow the known paths. But even so, c6, you can see he has set up the Stonewall structure. After bishop g2, knight to d7. That is almost never seen, the knight developing before the bishop and the other knight. Castles, and now bishop to d6. So it's kind of a version of the modern Stonewall, but with a little bit of a twist. b3, looking to exchange the bishop, but now queen e7, not allowing bishop a3 to exchange the bishop. Like we said, a very deep thinker. So queen c2, but now a little bit of a strange idea. He plays queen to f6. Now why black didn't play bishop to a3 is a little above and beyond me, but he played bishop g5, and on queen g6, then played bishop f4, looking to exchange the dark squared bishops. Well, this is probably a little bit dubious. Black takes, and now plays, rather than the expected knight f6, he plays knight to h6. And then on knight e5, he plays queen to h5. Well, white brings his queen over to the king side, queen d3, but now comes knight takes e5, f takes e5, and we can see why the knight is on h6, because there's no tempo. There's no need to move the knight again, and Bronstein is free to play f4. Now notice, it would be a mistake to simply castle, because white would then play f4, anchor in on the dark squares, leaving black pretty boxed in. But again, Bronstein, a very deep thinker, he gets in f4 first, and we can see the beauty of his having put the knight over on h6. Well, queen f3 offering to trade queens. Bronstein declines the queen trade, and on knight c3 plays knight to f5, touching up the e3 pawn, the d4 pawn. Well, rook at a to d1, castles. Now knight to h4 is contemplated, king to h1, bishop to d7 does not go after the bishop, rook to g1, and bishop to e8. So here we see a maneuver we mentioned before, bringing the bishop to h5. Well, queen h3. The idea with queen h3, now Bronstein plays queen to h5, offering to trade. After e4 comes pawn takes, pawn takes, queen takes, bishop takes. The idea is if you take on e3, you'll take on e6 with check. But we finally see bishop to h5. So notice, after bishop to h5, black has solved the problem of activating his bishop with the zigzag maneuver. That's one of the two options available for getting this guy into the game. Well, rook at d to f1. Notice that rook at d to e1 would allow bishop f3 check, bishop g2, and then the very clever knight to h4. After bishop takes, knight takes would be a cute knight fork. So after bishop h5, activating the bishop, then came rook at d to f1. And now, and only now, came knight takes on e3. Bishop takes e6 check, king h8, rook takes, and now white has to be very, very careful. In the game, he played rook to c1. Of course, pawn takes pawn in the center would be a huge mistake, because bishop f3 check, rook up, bishop check, and rook down, checkmate. So this shows the power of this bishop getting to h5, where it can be very close and play an instrumental role in attacking the white king. So it takes a while to get there, but once it's there, it can become a very powerful piece. From zero to hero. Well, after rook c1, play continued with rook penetration, rook to f2. Now again, c takes d5 is dangerous because check, king over, check. Note how the rook, knight, and bishop coordinate beautifully. King in the corner, and rook back anywhere along the g file is discovered checkmate. So after rook c1, rook f2, the white bishop hustled back. But now came rook f3 attacking the bishop. The bishop went back to e6, rook back to f2, bishop back to h3, so already black could play for a draw. But Bronstein was a great fighter. Instead played g5, looking to squeeze the bishop, also creating a little luft for his own king. Then came pawn takes pawn, and king to g1, attacking the rook. Well, the rook wanted to stay active on the second rank, and also puts a little heat on the white d4 pawn. White's not without his advantages. He's got a passed d pawn, and he pushes it. Pawn to g4, squeezing the bishop. Bishop back to f1, and then knight back to f5. This puts a second hit on the d4 pawn. The white knight drops back to e2, which also activates the white rook. King to g7, activating the king. Rook check. King up. The white rook is now in the house. Look at all these little munchkins that this white rook can dine on. He starts by taking the h7 pawn. Bishop comes back to g6. Rook takes another pawn. By this time, when I first saw this game, I'm like, is Bronstein doing this quite right? Well, knight e3. Pawn to e7. But then Bronstein, rather than pin and chase the false gold with rook d1, knight g3, he takes back a pawn. So at this point, black is only a pawn down. Then comes knight f4, and now the pin rook a1. Note that with rook a1, there's no time for knight takes because checkmate with the rook and knight. So in the game after rook a1, white flees and escapes with his king. But then comes rook check, king takes knight, but rook f3, the winning move, separating the white king from his knight on f4. Just a tremendous struggle in the endgame, a real cut and thruster. The remaining moves of the game were as follows. King up, takes, king up, rook e4 behind the passed pawn, rook takes, takes, and he's only got one pawn for it. He keeps an eye on it, and now he blockades everything in, and it's pretty easy. Black accepted white's resignation. After king f6, the remaining moves might be king up, and white will simply run out of moves. Easy peasy. Anyway, just a quick review of a very nice win in a tough USSR championship in 1947. But just a quickie look at Bronstein's original play here. Very unique idea, knight to d7 before developing the f6 knight or the dark squared bishop. On castles, he played bishop out, and now, interesting two-step with the queen. I don't think I've ever really seen it explained why he moved the queen 2 steps. On bishop to a3, was he really going to back up with this bishop? White saw another light, went this way, traded, but now the very nice move, knight to h6. That way, on the invasion with knight e5, and later when he took, very heads-up play to play f4. This led to a very promising endgame where black certainly was not worse, and then the other key idea was how he was able to activate his bishop later with the bishop c8 to d7 to e8 to h5. There's so much that we can learn from the great masters. This is why to just study modern opening theory without an appreciation of the chess history is a major mistake. When you talk to the great players like Magnus Carlsen, he can recite games from chess history. The same was true with Bobby Fischer and Kasparov and Karpov. All of these players, they know and appreciate chess history, and they learned a great deal from it. Anyway, an excellent example, I think, a series of historical games that these are games you can go over 2 or 3 times, and you will learn a lot of strategy in games and middle games, and by virtue, you will learn a lot better how to play the Stonewall Dutch with black.